provided by the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation as a part of the Transportation Risk Specialty program. These are presented every Thursday, 2 p.m. on the second Thursday of each month, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This is to update your information concerning things that are happening in the trucking industry that affects insurance. This does not qualify for state CE credit. We do have programs that do, and if you're seeking state CE, please look at our website and we will help you in those areas. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the chat window that you see on your page. We will attempt to answer them as we go. If we cannot answer them as we go because of the time restrictions, we will email you answers later. We have an expert with us today that can answer most of your questions and these concerns. Every now and then we do have some problems technology-wise, particularly auto and others. If you have any problems in those areas, please either put in the chat window or call our office at 800-741-4084, and we'll attempt to correct those as soon as possible. This webinar also will be posted on our website for later viewing if you need it, and there's certain parts of it we will email to you. It's my pleasure to have with us today Dale Reagan of Tenstreet, especially in the transportation area, helping motor carriers. Dale and I go back, as we just talked, for many, many years. He is what I consider the resident expert on MVRs, PSPs, and other things that are affecting our insureds as they select drivers and screen drivers as a part of their hiring program, which obviously affects the insurance of those risks. Dale's put material together. We're going to talk about and start and spend a significant part of time talk about the PSP. PSP stands for Pre-Employment Screening Program, and we'll get more detail in that. We'll also look at the new medical certification that are required for CDL drivers, and as a part of that, the National Medical Registry. There is some information that you need to be aware of, that you need to help your insureds with on that was effective May 21st, 2014. It's not only a requirement for hiring, and the DOT might can come in and police your insureds, but a concern from an insurance standpoint is that if your insured is not properly selecting or using the medical certificates that are requirements and the DOT physicals done by someone on the National Medical Registry, we could end up buying more liability at accident time for not properly doing that. And then there's been some court cases come down to adverse action that are involved in it. That part of it will also remind us that we need to sell employee practice liability, and Dale will go through those with you as he takes over the program in a few minutes. We're going to start talking about the Pre-Employment Screening Program, type PSP. This started in May 2010. It was started with one provider that was put into the law, and there you had to register with that provider and sign a contract with that provider and pay a fee for $100 if you're over 100 power units, and $50 if you have less than 100 power units, and then $10 for each report. The people who could get those reports are motor carriers for pre-employment purposes and individual drivers for their own individual records. That's all that could be obtaining these records. The program is subject to the Fair Credit Reporting Act. These are the same acts that are governing the MVRs. And so the sign-off sheets, the requirements of the driver to sign these forms are paramount, and therefore if you don't have it done right, there could be some liability coming back from not handling those documents. Anything that has to do with employment records such as MVRs or credit scoring, and those things are protected, and you need to handle those documents clearly. It can only be used for employment considerations, no other considerations, not insurance, no other. It is for the insured truck driver, truck or company users of CDL drivers to make sure that the drivers that they hire have favorable history, or at least history that meets their requirements for their own road activities. It is not available for the insurance industry use. The information that's reflected on this is their roadside inspections. When one of our insured vehicles gets stopped, the inspection report, what the DOT officers and the inspectors find, both favorable and unfavorable, are carried in two data banks available through the FMCSA. The one database is the Carrier Safety Measurement System. That's what we see through SAFER and through CSA and the scores that you have in the score basic. That's what drives that. That database, just briefly, is a 2-year rolling cycle with the most current period of time getting heavier weighted than the last. The second database is the Driver Safety Management System. That's the DSMS. This is the basis of the PSP. This is driver information. It's not tied to the motor carrier's DOT number. It's tied to the driver's name and his or her driver's license number. And that's every results of the inspection is then provided in this database, and a potential new employer can access that database. The big difference here is that database has 3 years of history on roadside inspections and 5 years for crashes. The information is only available for pre-employment screening and a DOT officer as well, and possibly plaintiff's attorneys. This is new in the court systems. How much this can be raised later, we'll talk about the court cases. Information is available only for all employees, which includes independent contractors and owner-operators, all potentially new employees, which includes independent contractors and owner-operators, as that is who is defined as an employee under FMCSA regs. The bottom line, the on-road activities, potential new employees can be accessed by the new potential employer. That's the key as a part of their hiring consideration. This allows the new employer to consider SMS violations as a part of their employee screening. In other words, do they meet our criteria in those areas? The information in the PSP is not the same as on MVRs, and Dale will get in detail about that as we go through the program in more detail. FMCSA reports results of the studies have shown that crashes are reduced and out-of-service violations are reduced when motor carriers use PSP. As we all hear from our experts and insurance providers, are you considering PSP as a part of your underwriting and claim information at crash time? So the point here is that this does reduce crashes. Us as insurance providers will need to consider that to complement or to look at risk to determine it going in if that risk is using it and is worth some consideration, both either on acceptability or pricing. And we also need to start tracking at crash time the insurance carrier's own individual history to see if the insured used PSP and compare them with risk who do not. Retail agents, how are you discussing this with your insureds? And also letting your insurance providers know if your insureds are using PSP. The retail agent should assist the motor carrier to control their crashes. This is a way to help do that. And the insurance carrier would need to know so that the insurance carrier can take this in consideration when they're looking at the overall acceptability and pricing of potential insured. Our friend Rob Mosley, who will be at our annual conference along with Dale October 16th and 17th in Orlando, made this comment. He said, picture yourself as an accident happened, and now you're the representative of the motor carrier and you're a witness on the stand. And you were asked the question, if you had used the PSP, the problem that caused the accident would have been found, and the driver would not have met your hiring qualifications, so would not have been hired. Therefore, the accident that injured my client would not have happened. What would it have cost you to have used the government-provided system to assist you in screening drivers to keep the bad drivers from behind the wheels of an 18-wheeler? The answer to that is $10. How far is that going to float in your jury when you're saying that you mean you didn't spend $10 to keep these people from being killed? This is what the system tends to do, is to weed out have the motor carriers to weed out these drivers who do not respect the federal FMCA's regs and rules on the highway. Again, today we have Dale Reagan. He's agreed to share his knowledge and expertise in in-depth discussion of PSP, as well as a couple of other recent things that are requiring for commercial motor vehicle drivers. There are some websites here, and our office, Beth, will send you information concerning these websites after we get finished for you who are attending this program, so you have these access. With that, Dale, will you tell us a couple of things about you, and will you take it over, my friend?
I will. I'll be glad to. I'm Dale Reagan with Tenstreet. I've been in the trucking industry all told about 40 years now, as a truck driver for a while, but also working with for-hire fleets and private fleets in safety, recruiting, and operations. After my trucking career, I was 13 years at what we used to call DAC services, is now Hire Right, and then here at Tenstreet for the last 8 years.
You want to talk about the screening process here, Dale? For 30 years, we used MVRs. Now we have this other means of doing it.
And that's a lot of the history of the MVR, and a lot of the controversy and questions that we see about the PSP is the MVR, or motor vehicle report, have been around for so long. Most motor carriers, and certainly all the insurance carriers, had developed formulas and thresholds and qualification guidelines built around the motor vehicle report. What we're seeing from our position is that the MVR at this point is being supplemented, and some people project may actually be replaced as a primary screening tool by the PSP report. And there's some significant differences between the two that I want to talk about and get into some of those differences today so that folks understand. Just an overview of the PSP report is available as part of CSA 2010. It is not at this time a required part of driver screening. Unlike the MVR, it is not required for the motor carrier to access that and review it prior to hiring. PSP, as Tommy mentioned, is a record of inspection history and crashes or accidents from the MCMIS database, and it's important to note accidents as defined by the DOT. Not every accident will be listed on a PSP report, only those that meet the threshold of being DOT recordable. So there will be smaller minor accidents that won't be recorded at all, and the PSP will record a driver's involvement in an accident whether they were cited or not. The other elements on there are some of the ways that they're significantly different. They come from different sources. These are different types of information. The motor vehicle report is provided by the state DMVs. It is state information. It's moving violation information. And this slide, again, a little bit of what I touched on earlier as far as developing standards and disqualifiers, and at what point in that screening process to request the PSP, because it's going to have a different information set than a motor vehicle report. It's going to show inspection data. It's going to show inspection violation and out-of-service orders. It will show accident involvement, not necessarily responsibility or fault for the accident. It will have some crossover with the MVR, but again, the motor vehicle report, having been the kind of the gold standard of driver screening for so long, I think the industry is still trying to understand how to integrate this new information that's available with the PSP.
Dale, in talking about this, the couple examples that I share, and I would you comment on it or agree or disagree with it, is that a couple of differences. The MVRs are for both commercial use and personal use. That shows all your driving habits, where PSPs just commercial motor vehicles. But as the point you just made, the driver could be involved in an instance that would have maybe been cited in his MVR as a violation, but the PSP would not. The example that I use is a driver can be stopped and found to have drugs in the cab, or have even kind of weird is that if they have consumed any alcohol in the 4 hours before they started driving, that's a violation. In fact, that's the only thing that's prohibited for a driver not to do before they go on service, and that is have alcohol within 4 hours. But the driver does not have a impairment of 0.02, so that's not shown up on his or her MVR, which it would be interesting to know if the driver is using alcohol at that lower level that would not show up in MVR. Is that kind of the differences in them?
That's some of the differences, yes. That's a good example in that that's not strictly a moving violation per se, but it is a violation that in an inspection, if it was discovered, would be noted on a PSP report.
In fact, in a lot of, and as this report, and one thing that we failed to mention, I'm sorry, I should have done this in introduction, this is available for all CDL drivers. It's not just for for-hire truckers. The private fleets can also access this information. So it's anybody who uses a vehicle that requires a commercial driver's license. The definition of commercial motor vehicles for this purpose is any vehicle that has a GVW of 26,001, any vehicle that has more than 15 seats in it, any vehicle that has a combination of power unit and trailer 26,001, and any vehicle that has to be placarded, then that driver must have a commercial driver's license. And in those cases, with that DOT number that's assigned to that motor carrier they're working for, then their information will be reflected in the PSP. Am I correct about that?
That's correct. The only other qualifier is if a vehicle has air brakes.
Okay, that would be okay.
That requires a CDL, but I don't know of many that don't meet the other criteria that would have air brakes. So essentially, yes, that's correct.
So the PSP is showing us the roadside activities in commercial motor vehicles as we just defined, where the MVRs show all activities in all vehicles. And there's a crossover, and I know that you've got a little more later about those differences in the slide. And your insurers are using the PSP as a part of their pre-employment screening. Is this correct?
The vast majority of them are, yes. In fact, unofficial survey of my client base, the PSP report disqualifies more candidates than any other single screening criteria, and most of the drivers that we talk to are unaware. If they are aware of the PSP report, they haven't seen one. So the drivers really are not taking advantage of the opportunity to access their reports and see what's on there.
Let me ask you this question. That brings something up that has a motor carrier, if there's a violation on their record, can go to data queue to straighten that out. So I've got a two-pronged question here. If the motor carrier goes to data queue and straightens it out and finds out that that violation that's shown on their SMS score is not their vehicle, or they got now later they take it to court and they get adjudicated where it gets dismissed, then it has to be taken off. Will that also be taken off on the driver, or does the driver need to take separate action to get that record expunged from them?
The driver would need to take separate action because those two databases are different. One is organized by the motor carrier numbers. The other one is identified by the driver. And the driver in that instance would need to make their own efforts, and the drivers should be taking steps to make sure that inaccurate information, incorrect information is not on their record.
Good. I hadn't thought about that, but that would be a reason to check that part of it, particularly if they're intending to move employment, because that would be a vital, important part of potentially the new employer record part of it. The other problem that we have, and I don't know if you've seen any resistance to this from an insurance carrier standpoint, the number one, as you know, criteria of providing insurance to a motor carrier is the quality of their drivers. have you seen any problems with people with bad PSPs or bad history, roadside history, let's don't say PSP, roadside history, where they go to a motor carrier that uses PSP, decides that maybe I don't want to apply there, so they apply to a motor carrier who's not using this because they won't be screened that way? Do you see this happening in the industry?
Anecdotally, we do. The drivers can job shop, and certainly with the demand out there, everybody's willing to take their application. Whether they're aware of the fact that they got hired because a carrier is not using a PSP report is open to some debate and some interpretation, but I think it is inevitable that the guys with the really bad inspection problems, the guys with the serious safety issues, are migrating, being pushed to the carriers that aren't running that PSP report.
Wow. As you mentioned here on your slide, there is a driver shortage. You want to talk a few minutes about that?
The driver shortage certainly is probably old news to this audience. My carrier customers, motor carrier customers, aggregately are short thousands and thousands of drivers, and what is kind of a recent phenomenon is the smaller and smaller percentages of applicants that are actually qualified. That number across my customer base, about 30% of the applicants that they receive, applications they get, are from a driver that's qualified for them. Of that 30% that they're then recruiting and working and trying to get in a seat, only about 10% of those guys actually start orientation. So the numbers get pretty daunting pretty fast for a trucking company. They've got to take so many applications just to find qualified candidates. Of those qualified candidates, so few of them start orientation. They've got to throw a very wide net to try to keep their capacity constant.
And in this case, when you're talking about the average minimum qualification, that's that individual motor carrier's qualifications that could be driven by their own desire to keep their operations safe, or requirements that the insurance carrier has suggested that they must use to be able to keep their insurance in place, or in some cases to take retention. So we're talking about their own qualifications here, correct? Not
Exactly.
imposed. There's none imposed by the government, and then the only one that's really imposing anything is self-policing or self-proposal and insurance industry requirements. But man, that's a costly process, then, is it not, Dale?
It's unbelievably expensive, and time-consuming, and a pretty volatile situation for motor carriers that are trying to keep constant capacity available for their customers.
You said that you would have a lot of money if you had 20,000 drivers that you could put on your customers' vehicles a day, right? If you were getting a fee.
I could put every one of them to work tomorrow and retire the day after that.
I know that next you shared with us a couple examples. Will you walk through this and just tell us how this stuff differed in the two that we have in here, just to show examples of where the MVRs and PSPs might or might not match up?
I will, and these are some examples that my clients had forwarded me, and this is kind of the old criteria and the new criteria. But the number one's a 40-year-old guy with 7 years total verifiable experience. He's had one job over 3 years. His MVR, one speeding violation and no accidents. This is a top 1% driver. He's got a lot of experience. Verifiable. His MVR is virtually clean and doesn't have an accident history. But this same driver on the PSP report shows a history of violations, including a reckless, which for most of my clients is the kiss of death, and a speeding 10 to 15 over, and a failure to obey a traffic signal. So these are elements that are on the PSP that are not reflected in the motor vehicle report, even though if those had been actual citations, they would have been on the MVR, especially the reckless and the speeding and the failure to obey.
Now, in that case, would it be, Dale, that sometimes a DOT officer has this mentality, and what we mentioned here on the bottom is what they write up as the reason they stopped that vehicle, they noted there, but they didn't go to the point to issue them a ticket, quote unquote, against their MVRs. Is this where this disconnect happens, that the DOT officer is more focused on their DOT regs and inspections and all, and they note this is why what the driver's actions were doing prior to them being stopped, or this is why they stopped them, and note those things without taking the process of citing them on MVRs? Is this where this disconnect happens?
We believe that to be exactly correct. In the states that require a probable cause to pull over a motor vehicle, what we find, what we see very commonly is that inspection officer is listing the reason that they pulled this vehicle over in the first place. And that's not a citation. That's not a moving violation per se. It's a,
to go against the MVR, right.
Yeah, it's a notation on a PSP report as to the reason he pulled this driver over and what initiated this inspection or this contact. And we think that's the major problem with this, because how a motor carrier regards these notations, they really can't consider them as moving violations on an MVR. It hasn't been through that process. It wasn't a citation. It wasn't a traffic enforcement officer that wrote this up. That driver's had no opportunity in a court to contest it or get any kind of clarification on it, and they stay in those PSP reports until the driver can get something done about it, or if not, then forever.
The 3-year cycle part of it. Yeah, two reasons that have been brought to me, Dale, is sometimes the DOT officer, again, focusing on DOT requirements, not the MVR policeman like your typical highway patrol or sheriff's department involved in it. But they also recognize, again, you just mentioned it, that if they issue a speeding ticket or a violation against the driver's license itself and that driver contested it, that officer who cited them might have to show up in court. But by doing it through the PSP, they're making that record known, but they don't have to defend it in court. There's no court action. And the second part of it is kind of interesting. I had a risk who was not familiar with this, that their driver got a citation, as you just mentioned, going into Virginia, and they went through a whole hoops, and they even called a lawyer to fight the ticket. And I asked them the question that you just came up with: did they, was this cited on the DOT officer report? Yes. Were they issued a violation? And they found out no. I said that you don't need a lawyer. There's nothing to fight. So both of the misunderstanding of those two things as they relate is very important. And what you're saying is that there could be a disconnect, and the PSP actually might be more indicative of what the DOT officer sees on the highway than sometimes MVRs.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Second, then you got.
Another case study, again, a driver that, according to the old way of screening, would have been, I would have driven to this guy's house and picked him up to get him to come drive a truck for me with his experience and what was showing on his record. And again, his PSP report had some information that wasn't reflected anywhere else, especially the second item on there: driver uses or is in possession of drugs, which is a pretty damning statement in and of itself because of the wording. And it's unclear reading this, and again, a motor carrier looking at this report, does that mean this guy had narcotics? Does it mean he had a prescription of prohibited substance? Does it mean he had a bottle of cough syrup in his truck? It could have been any of those. And again, that he didn't fail a drug test. This is a notation on a PSP inspection report that's not reflected anywhere else. It's certainly not reflected in criminal records, and calls in, Tommy, the same issues that we've been talking about. How does a motor carrier handle this what's their recourse, and what's the driver recourse, which is essentially, because it is a PSP notation, very, very cloudy right now.
Well, and again, even if they had a drug test, if they did not go .02, they were not impaired, even though they'd been using drugs or alcohol or drugs in that case, and it would not shown on the MVR, but it would have been shown up here. This is that's a real question. As you mentioned, if they had the prescription, it could have been a prescription, but they didn't have the prescription with them. It could be just something as simple as those kind of things. But that is a great difference between the two here. Obviously, speeding is important, but again, and the effective lights clearly are not shown on MVRs. But so these are the kind of things that you might see, Dale, where you take a driver that you said that would be pristine, driving to that you want to hire, that this other data then shows maybe some things that need to be looked into. Now, in this case that we have here, would your typical client look into this in more depth to find out exactly about this drug and alcohol possession? I assume that most of your clients have a zero tolerance in that area, because that's a strong recommendation to find out exactly what that is, to see if there needs to be some internal hiring modification to say it's acceptable or not.
This client did, but only because otherwise this was a stellar candidate for a driver that was a marginal applicant. They probably wouldn't make any efforts. Their only recourse is to get back to try to get the original inspection forms and notes that inspector filled out on the scene, on the site, and see if in those original notes there's any clarification offered as to what triggered those citations.
All right, that's interesting. Let's talk a bit about the program, because it has changed over the 2 years that we've had it, or 4 years now that we've had it in process.
It has. Again, it's designed to get a different data source than what had traditionally been available in front of motor carriers. It was designed to supplement the MVR with another report that showed safety behaviors. And a safety manager that trained me for a long time used to tell me that he regarded an MVR as just what you got caught doing, which is true to a certain extent. The PSP certainly gives a more well-rounded history of what that driver's attitude is towards safety. It is voluntary, again, for employers. I think as time goes on, it will become a de facto, if not officially required screening tool, just because the potential liabilities for not accessing that report are so high. What is unique about the PSP, the driver must provide written consent. That means a signed release, and the release language that the FMCSA has put out for the PSP report is very specific and cannot be deviated from. MVR releases, depending on the state, may or may not be absolutely required. The states may or may not do audits, but MCIEF, who's the sole provider of the PSP report, very actively audits their subscribers to ensure that they've got those signed releases from the driver. And again, that release has got to reflect the official FMCSA wording, which changed last January.
And so they must stay current with that part of it. This is why they need to go to a provider like yourselves or others who are astute in this, or the original deal. You and I mentioned earlier, because last year during your annual conference this came up too, the big difference in May 21st when it rolled out, and then October 20th, 2010. Didn't you tell me that the two big changes in that change is, first the became more than one provider, and second, the retention of the record itself, which is important to know, because the motor carrier has a retention of the PSP report requirement that they must adhere to, or could be, I guess, problems even penalized. Could they not? They'll be fined for not handling it that way?
They could be, as a record-keeping violation, either in a DOT audit or an NICS audit. The motor carrier is required to retain the PSP report for 3 years after the hiring or retention decision was made.
But after 3 years, don't they then have to expunge it?
After 3 years, they're required to destroy the document, and the recommended method of doing that is to shred it. So they're required to keep it for 3 years. After 3 years, they must destroy it.
And this record can only be used for pre-employment purposes, not post-employment. And we talked earlier about your feelings about the an insurance personnel coming in and looking at those records. Other than verifying that the insured is doing this, you have some apprehensions about those records to be able to be viewed by the insurance industry other than they exist.
I do, because the regulations concerning who at the motor carrier can look at it are pretty restrictive. The FMCSA regulations governing the PSP report state that only individuals that are involved in the hiring decision or contracting decision, in the case of an independent contractor, owner, operator, only the people at that company that are involved in making that decision will be able to view that report. It can't be shared with operations or HR, the safety department, in as much as safety may make that hiring decision. But even inside that motor carrier, there's a pretty short list of people that can look at that, and I have to think, as restrictive and prohibitive as that is, the ability of an insurance underwriter to come in and take a look at those would be legally on really, really thin ice right at the edge.
Wow. Okay, the other thing is, some people who aren't familiar with this that might be online don't realize the reason this is only pre-employment. Once I hire the driver, once I hire Dale, and then with my own individual PIN number, I can go in and get the activities of Dale on the highway while he is driving for me. The stuff that we see on a routine basis in SAFER and PSP, SAFER and SMS and CSA, we see the vehicle serial number, we see the tag number, we see the violation, but we don't see the driver's name. But if we had the motor carrier's PIN number, we will be able to see the driver's name also. So a driver or employee who's working for me, I can keep track of his activities or her activities in the vehicles that I own that have my DOT name on the side, and vehicles I have leased that have my DOT name on the side, as long as they're employed with me. So there's no need to have this record once somebody is employed.
That's correct, because they're going to bridge over into your database, and they're going to be recorded under your operating authority.
Now, the interesting report that I alluded to earlier is that some statistical history shows that people who are using this process have fewer crashes and have better scores. Will you talk a little bit about this report and what was found on this, Dale?
And that's released fairly recently by MCIEF that shows some pretty significant reductions in accidents and out-of-service orders. If you were to go on their website, it'd give you a little more of a breakdown by carrier size, but it is significant. I think it was 12% and 17%. Is that correct, Tommy?
Yeah, it depends on the size of it, and that would be on the next. Let's see. Here's the actual report that came out.
There we go. So if you look at this across the board, all sizes of trucking companies using this experienced reduction. It looks like most significantly in the fleets that were 6 to 20 drivers, but 8 and 17% are certainly statistically significant differences.
Wow. So it not only improves their crashes, it makes sure that they don't get as many citations, so it will affect their CSA scores too. That's an impressive number, and one, again, that if I'm an underwriter, I would maybe want to start thinking about this as a part of my acceptance or pricing of risk, or if I'm a retail agent, this would be something that you would think that you could encourage them to take advantage of so that their risk would be a better insurable risk, both from a CSA score as well as from the from the crash standpoint.
And the crash prevention numbers are here on this slide, again broken down by fleet size, and just some extrapolation of that data and the number of accidents that were prevented, and out of service orders that were reduced by that carrier group that's using the PSP.
Wow. All right. This is a sample report. You want to briefly talk about this? It's kind of hard to see on the screen.
It is a little bit hard to see. The main takeaway from here, the PSP report is in a standard format, unlike an MVR where each state may have their own format, their own system for presenting that information. It's going to be standardized with the driver information across the top, the accident history in the next section, again going back 5 years, crash details, and then at the bottom, the 3-year inspection history. Basic information, identifying the driver, listing the results of inspections and the violations found in inspections. What is really key here is the inspections where the driver does not get a violation are also included in the PSP report. Unfortunately, get that many drivers, as soon as that inspection's over, if they've managed to come through there without a violation and without a problem, they're typically only too willing to get back in that truck and get as far away from the place as they possibly can. But it's really crucial to make sure those guys stick around and get that thing completed, because that good information, that positive inspection with no violation, also counts toward that motor carrier's CSA score.
Wow, that would help, and their own acceptability. That would help too.
Own acceptability.
I was with Ann Fury in a program that was in the ATA program in Dallas about 3 years ago, and she was disappointed about the numbers of people who've accessed this. But this chart you provided us shows that there is every year a major increase in usage.
There is every year, and we expect 2014 to continue this same upward trend, because more and more, for 2 reasons really, more and more motor carriers are utilizing the report, and what we have seen as far as the hiring process, the hiring workflow, more and more of those carriers are moving the PSP report forward, meaning that it's one of the first things they access. Initially, a lot of my clients were only running a PSP report on the drivers that showed up for orientation or who otherwise qualified for them. And so many of them were getting disqualified. That PSP report is now one of the first that they'll request, which does 2 things. It drives up the number of PSP reports that are requested in the report volume. But for a motor carrier, if you have sequenced your screening process, you're also able to route those guys out of your process much earlier.
Which saves people's time, right?
It saves time and it saves money, because the longer that driver is a viable candidate for you, you're spending money on him with reports, or you're throwing resources at him with recruiters or processors or safety personnel.
I just gave briefly a slide about the differences that we have, and we've already talked about those before. As most of you all know, through the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation, I've tried to get people who can help our retail agents, the retail agent insurance company, to help the insured. Dell and I at Tenstreet have been talking about this for a long time, and a lot of concern. Dale deals with the larger truckers, and he and I have talked for years about the ability to get to smaller truckers, and the retail agent has the access to that. So to that end, Tenstreet has a program that will allow PSP screening, and part of that program you can find from them how to order it and those kind of things. And Dale is the source of this information. It does require 10%, but you need to be a client of 10th Street. So retail agents, if you have a desire to help your insured get involved in this and assist them in their employment process, I strongly recommend you getting hold of Dale and see what he can deal with you from a cost standpoint to encourage them to start using these kind of services and using the screening part of this too. And as we point out here, you need to talk about handbooks and other things, and they'll help you walk through this to stay out of trouble. But call Dale, he's aware of this, and will help you get involved in the PSP. I believe it's a vital part of what we're going to do in the future, and I think our insureds need to understand this, and he has offered his services to try to assist them to be involved in it, particularly the smaller motor carriers that his companies or other companies like himself cannot reach that retail agents do. With this said, Dale, let's move from PSP. There's a couple other things that have happened recently. We got about another 15 minutes. Let's talk about those things. Like the next one is the medical certification process that we've all heard about that was effective in May of this year.
The medical certification, briefly, requires that anyone performing a DOT physical is certified through the FMCSA. They've got to be able to pass the certification test, and quite frankly, many of the clinics, whether an OCMED clinic or certainly family doctors, are declining to go through that certification process. The problem that's creating is really twofold. The drivers are having more problems finding somebody to do a DOT physical because the other change in the regulation is an attempt to synchronize the driver's license, the CDL license, with the medical card. And again, to summarize that, a driver that has an expiration date coming up on their medical, the states are now recording the medical certification expiration dates as part of the CDL license.
The renewal of the license.
Not just the renewal of the license, because the situation can exist that the medical certificate can expire before the CDL license expires.
Okay.
Those dates are not entirely synchronized. In that case, it's the responsibility of the driver to go to his local DMV office and present his new medical certification card so that the state can update that field on his MVR and on his license. The mechanism for non-compliance, and again, the driver is the only one that can do this, is that the states automatically downgrade that CDL. So the driver is effectively not qualified if they were a CDL A driving an appropriate vehicle and don't advise the state of their new medical expiration date and show them their new card. They're now effectively downgraded to the lowest level of CDL license, which means they're not qualified to operate that equipment.
Wow. And I understand that this was supposed to be enforced in all states last January. It was put off for a year just because the states weren't ready to do it. But this is going to be, states have rolled this in, but this is going to be absolute requirement as January 2016, January 31st, 2016. Is that the drop dead date that's now published?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and the information we have is they're not going to deviate from that. Next slide. Again, going back to the medical examiner certification, this is actually a new element that's required to be in the driver qualification file, which is the medical examiner's certificate to go along with that medical card showing that that examiner is certified, is capable and able, legally entitled to do a DOT physical. And the problem on the ground that has created, Tommy, you and I were talking about this, so many of these clinics that used to do DOT physicals as a sideline did not decide to pursue the certification process, therefore are not legally licensed to do a DOT physical. What I hear from clients here in the Tulsa area, Tulsa's a metropolitan area, you know, greater Tulsa is probably close to 1 million people, is that there's actually 4 clinics in greater Tulsa that are certified to do a DOT physical. And in some rural areas, that's even more acute.
Wow. And we're going to get the register here in a second. But this certification, so you not only have to have the DOT physical form filled out by this new certified medical examiner, but you also will have to have something, documentation, that they actually have met these qualifications, and that must be in the file also. This really creates a situation where the driver brings their own medical with them. Obviously, as we move forward past 2000 and May 2014, there are going to be more and more that are going to be done after that date that the driver brings with them as a part of the employment. And at that point, the new potential employer looking at this driver's medical, which they're required to do, if it's done after May 21st, 2014, then they've got to certify that the person who performed that physical, even though they did not arrange for it, meets these criteria, correct?
That's correct.
And that's a real cumbersome situation. If they don't do that, if they get a DOT officer inspection, they could be fined, can they not, or find a problem with the basic scores of not having the adequate paperwork? Is that the consequences of this?
Both of those. You're looking at a pretty significant hit to your CSA basic score, and you're looking at a fine that's going to be levied for each instance of noncompliance.
Will the DOT inspector on the roadside, will he or she also be able to, or will they be trying to look at these physicals to make sure they're done by someone certified?
I think that on the roadside, the DOT inspector is going to accept a medical certification, the standard card that they've been taking for all these years.
Okay. The registry, you want to talk briefly about this?
Boy, this is, I don't know if you can talk briefly about this. I can certainly, I'll tell you what I'll do.
We got 10 minutes, 8 minutes. Give us an overview, Dale.
Here's the overview. Cut and paste that URL out of this slide and go in and take a look at it. This is just an overview of the medical examiners that are listed that are now certified, and they are in a central registry, so that as motor carriers start to hunt around, if their previous OCMED clinic tells them they're not doing a DOT physical anymore, they're not qualified, they're not certified, they can go to this location, enter in a city, state, or a zip code, and start searching the radius. Anecdotally, what we understand is the rural parts of many states, drivers may have to drive 50 miles or more each way to get to a certified medical clinic.
This slide you see in front of you, folks, is something you can access by going to the FMCSA webpage. You can access that by going directly there, or us who are accustomed to going SAFER all the time. When you look at the SAFER webpage, where we focus on the middle column with a snapshot, on the right-hand column that you'll see is the FMCSA website, and if you go there, they have a link to this national registry, and as you see here, you can put in the city or the zip code, and they'll give you a list of people who have qualified for this. Understand that qualified, they have to pass a test and also pay a fee and some things like that, which they're not only going to weed them out, they're going to make the examination probably more strict, are they not, from the standpoint of screening people?
Yes. And what it should do, the impact it should have for the motor carriers, is that they shouldn't have to double check these long form physicals anymore to make sure that a doctor has completed it, that it is legible, that this guy's blood pressure is within the acceptable parameters, because part of the certification process is making those medical professionals aware of what they're required to do. And there's ramification and there's blowback for them if they don't generate a compliant product out to the motor carrier.
Wow, and of course the thing that troubles me, and you've already alluded to this driver shortage, these last two things we talked about, PSP and the medical certification process where the drivers are now being screened in more depth, or at least with more knowledgeable people from the physical condition, both of those tend to weed some of these people out of the marketplace, and again, to exasperate this driver shortage problem.
They do. Everything seems to be working toward eliminating some drivers. And I see we're on the adverse action slide.
Yeah, we got 5 minutes or so. If you want to take a couple minutes here on tell us what's happening to this and what drives this stuff, and then the part of the employee practice liability, maybe to take care of this. If you want to talk a few minutes about this, Dale, I'd appreciate it.
Adverse action is a legal term, and adverse action is defined as a decision not to hire or retain or contract an individual based on information contained in a consumer report. Short definition of a consumer report is anything a motor carrier is acquiring or requesting or buying from a consumer reporting agency. HireRight, my old employer, is a consumer reporting agency. Everything a motor carrier buys from them, MVRs, CITLS reports, SSN, criminal records, PSP reports, everything that they generate and provide a motor carrier is considered a consumer report, and it comes under these regulations. We don't have time to discuss the one-step and two-step. The downside to this for motor carriers is there is a very specific criteria that starts with the application as far as release language and advisement of consumer rights, ability and access to get in and make changes if this information is incorrect, and then whether or not the motor carrier follows through on their other responsibility after the application. Once they make this adverse action, once they make this decision, there's a follow-up process that they've got to execute to be compliant here. Next slide, SWIFT.
Dale, hold on a second. You and I have had this discussion, and even last year in the annual conference, somebody questioned this. Folks, this is why you cannot provide MVRs to your insureds, because when you provide MVRs to insureds, you become a source of this information, and you could be subject to these same things if you don't do it all right. Do you agree with that, Dale? That's why the insurance industry can't do it. This is the downside to it. It's why you cannot provide MVRs to your insureds, because you can't conform to all this, and the companies like HireRight and other people who do this are make sure the sign-off sheets and all at least meet some formality to it. But even with their background, you still can have some violations.
You can. SWIFT is the very high profile. They were not advising plaintiffs on the release that they were going to do criminal record checks. Actually, since this decision came down, there's been another major carrier on the East Coast that incurred an $800,000 fine because of the wording on their releases.
And these are and you get these two examples here that you showed us here, the Kmart and the Domino's.
Yep, these are obviously non-DOT carriers, but they serve as a notice that the enforcement arm and consumer rights are a very hot topic politically right now, and that the enforcement agents are, and primarily this is the FEC, they're going after companies that are not complying with every letter of the law, and compliance of this law can be pretty detailed and can be quite a process.
So that's why they need to relate companies who understand all this stuff. Dale, we really appreciate your time and effort on this. Again, we're out of time, so we need to get out of here. Dale will be with us in Orlando in our annual conference on October 16th and 17th for you who want to be more detailed in this area and meet him personally. He also has contributed to these webinars once or twice a year. He's our resident expert in this. I've had questions that you all have come back with me and asked me that I refer to Dale. Our next webinar will be September the 11th, again at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and we'll be talking about the federal drug testing programs and particularly the new clearinghouse database to help us walk through that. And with that said, Dale, again, I thank you very much for your time and effort, and everybody else, I hope you all have a good day and successful month until we talk to you next month. We're out of here.